Hi. Sunday, October 27th, 2024. It's a cool, rainy Sunday morning here in eastern North Carolina. I mentioned my location this morning because I stayed up a little bit late watching a concert for the Carolinas fundraiser for the western part of the state. A number of musical acts from North Carolina performed on a live stream last night, and I think I turned it off after about midnight, 12:30, and some other folks still hadn't been on stage yet, so I think it was a late night last night in Charlotte to raise money. If you want to contribute to our outreach to our neighbors in western North Carolina following the hurricanes and all the historic flooding and damage done, there is a link to Week of Compassion, theweekofcompassion.org. We'd be happy to manage a gift to them. If you want to use the Givelify button, which is the green button on the home page here, and just put in the memo for hurricane relief, and we will get that to the Week of Compassion. Glad to do that for you. They do very good work. I'm a little tired this morning, but we will get this done. I'm indebted to a couple of preachers this morning who approached our text in a different way and gave me a different perspective on it, and I think it was helpful to me, and I hope that this is helpful to you this morning. Our scripture comes from the Gospel of Mark. We're still in the Gospel of Mark. We're in chapter 10, 35 to 45. Mark 10, 35 to 45. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him and they said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask." "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus said. They said, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other at your left hand when you come into your glory." "You don't know what you're asking," Jesus says. "Can you drink the cup I drink or be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with?" "We can," they said. He said to them, "Well, you will drink the cup I drink and will be baptized with the baptism I am baptized with, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they've been prepared." The other 10 disciples heard about it. They became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them all together to calm everything down, and he said, "You know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them, but it is not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, to give his life for many." This is where the other preachers were helpful for me. We all make sense of the world by hanging our experiences on a framework in our minds. If we step outside and we see a bird fly overhead, that is validated by our previous experience, and we say, "Yes, birds fly." And we reinforce that by putting a little check mark on our framework that says, "Yep, birds have the ability to fly." If we step outside and a pig flies overhead, we don't know what to do because we have not had that experience before. We reject that experience out of hand when we see it. That didn't happen. Or we invent an explanation, "Well, surely that pig wasn't really flying. Something hurled it and I saw it." Or we reconstruct the framework of our understanding and we make a new construct that ascribes to pig's ability to fly. Our brain works to make sense out of things. That's the job of our brains. It's to place things onto a scaffolding in our mind so that we can reference it again. And then when we see it again, it reinforces it and puts a little check mark and says, see, I told you so. And when we can't make sense of an experience, we struggle to function and understand. So, applied to our faith, even an atheist has faith, a different framework on which to hang his experiences and his interpretations of the world. In his experience, there's no evidence of a loving God because he's asked the questions, how could a good and loving God tolerate all the hatred in the world? How could a good and loving God allow the Holocaust to happen? How could an all-powerful, all-loving God let bad things happen to good people? And because there aren't any good answers to those questions, he rejects the idea of God completely and constructs a framework in his mind that does not include God. For the atheist, it makes more sense to look at the world that way than to imagine a God who doesn't step into history and time to rescue people from death or people from bad experiences. A godless world fits his experience. And that becomes his faith. That becomes the reinforcement. See, I told you so. Now we do the same thing. We equivocate. We are hypocritical. We lean toward one text over another text. We highlight one thought over another thought, especially about God. In Genesis, for example, God created humans, and God made the difference between them male and female. There were deliberate, intentional differences between the two creatures that God made human, male and female. Those are the only difference. The only distinctions in the biblical accounts is male and female. And our brains, based on our book of faith, construct that story as foundational. That's fact in our mind. And for most of us, that scaffolding has been in place since early childhood and reinforced over years and years and years of preachers and Bible studies and movies and books and all of that. Now, in the thousands of years since those texts were written and shared in oral history, human brains constructed other differences between human beings, other things that makes humans different, that separate us. And we attribute those differences also to God. For example, some people actually believe that people whose skin pigment is darker have evil blood. Their blood is like poison. They are less than human. They are less than us. They are the other. And that, my friends, is a human construct. Something that our brains, over time, created a scaffold to hold up as true. And we accept it as truth, even in our faith. We even say that God did that, intended that. There is purpose behind those differences, even though we created them in our minds. Some hold it as biblical, even though our faith, our history, our systems, our scriptures absolutely do not. And that's a problem. Because in that example, the thought that people who are different from us are bad or evil is about as truthful as a flying pig. I say all that because the result, the actions that we make based on those beliefs, racism, sexism, those things aren't biblical, and they have no place in the construct of our faith. Yet there they are, right? So what do we do about them? We have to open our eyes to see things the way that Jesus tells us that God sees things. Jesus was very clear. There's a biblical way to see things, a better biblical worldview. The Bible presents the world as a gift, creation as a gift given to the world from an all-powerful, all-loving creator who wanted nothing more to be in relationship with creation that he created, male and female. Now, the story goes that when those early creations rejected that kind of love, the story of our faith says that God started over again, and he flooded the world, and he saved one family, and God's hope was that that one family would teach their children to love and serve the Lord, and they would teach their children, and so on and so forth, until the whole world was filled with good, godly people who knew God and understood God. And that, in the historical, biblical story, did not work. Now, this time, instead of starting over, God started with one man, one person among many, and promised him an inheritance and an inheritor if he would stay faithful. And this one did. Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and then the 12 sons became the 12 tribes of a new nation, and they were delivered from their slavery in Egypt and brought into the promised land, and everything looked great. And these folks settled there, and they raised crops, and they raised children, and they crowned a king who laid claim to even more land. Fast forward, the kingdom was divided, the kings became corrupt, the Assyrians came in from the north, the Babylonians came in from the south. They were all taken into exile, and it looked like everything was lost again. And then, though, a remnant of the 12 tribes returned to the land and worked to rebuild Israel, and over several more generations, they nourished the hope that one day a new king would come that wouldn't be corrupt. And this one new king would restore the nation to its former glory, and that new king would be called Messiah. Whew. And that, my friends, is the biblical faith that the disciples had. That's the story that was on the framework in the disciples' minds. That's the way that they made sense of the world, was through that story. And that's the reason they were so excited that they believed Jesus was that new king, that new Messiah. And they followed him, and they witnessed his mighty works and his healings and listened to his stories, and became more and more convinced that he was, in fact, the one that they'd been waiting for. Even Peter said it. He said, "You're the Messiah," and Jesus didn't correct him. He didn't deny it. So sure enough, they got really excited. Jesus is the long-awaited Messiah. All their dreams were about to come true. He'd march into Jerusalem and drive those awful Romans far away. And he would take his place as the successor to their ancestor David. And then, it's only logical in the framework in my mind, there'd be a place of privilege on the right and to the left. For all those who stayed with him, thrones on the left and thrones on the right. Now, if that were your framework of understanding, you can see how you'd have no place to hang the idea of a sacrificial Messiah, a crucified Messiah, no place for the forgiveness of your enemies, those Romans or whoever else you're against. No place to love your neighbor. Why am I wasting my time with my neighbor? I am now elevated better than my neighbor because I am seated at the right hand of the Messiah. And when Jesus announced he was going to Jerusalem, yes, the royal city, that's where the throne of David is. Yes, it all makes perfect sense. It's all coming to fruition. But then Jesus talked about being handed over to his enemies, to submit, about being condemned to death. And for the disciples, it's kind of like watching a flying pig just go right overhead. He didn't really say that. He was just kidding. It's just a figure of speech. He didn't mean it. We didn't hear him right. Or they try to reconstruct the framework completely to include the crucified Messiah, and that was just something they weren't willing to do. So they made excuses, and they went right on living the illusion of a conquering hero riding in on a horse with a sword to take out the bad guys. See, it's hard when scriptures like this shake us and rattle the way that we see the world, it's hard to learn or relearn what we need to know, especially about God, because those things have been on the frameworks in our minds for years. We could talk all day about how hard change really is. And we should be careful not to judge the disciples too harshly. It's a difficult thing to alter the whole framework of your mind, of your understanding of the world. And there's always a risk anytime you do it. When you're reaching across an empty space to put a new girder into place in your mind, and you've got a wrench in one hand and a bolt stuck between your teeth, and you're reaching and thinking that the whole thing could collapse right on top of you. But that's what Jesus wants us to do. The definition of insanity is not trying the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result. The definition of insanity is the inability to make meaning. The inability to make meaning, to build that framework so that our minds have a handle on things. That's a much more serious thing, because without a framework, you can't make sense of the world anymore, and you can't make sense of what you're doing in the world and where you belong. And when that happens to you, when texts like this come along and shake us, it sort of makes every experience a flying pig experience until we make sense of it. And maybe it'd be better to just focus on something else. Maybe it'd be better to just leave things as they are. And it's under those circumstances that James and John come to Jesus, right after he told them a third time that he was going to die. Teacher, ignoring his last comment, teacher, we want you to do us a favor. Okay, what's that? When you come into your glory, could we have the thrones on either side of you, or the ones on the left and the ones on the right? Can we be seated there with you? And Jesus just stops what he's doing and he stares at them. Are you insane? Didn't I just say that things are not going to play out the way that you think they're going to play out? Have you heard nothing that I've said? And I have to imagine there was just this long silence before anybody said anything. Can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? Can you be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized with? In other words, are you going to be able to do the suffering, or am I going to have to do it? But James and John don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. Are they in denial? Probably. They're not willing to admit that they don't know the answer when the teacher calls them up to the chalkboard in the front of the class. So they just trudge on in their ignorance. Sure, they say, no problem. We can do whatever you need us to do. And you just have to imagine Jesus just shakes his head with wonder and with sadness. As for who gets seated next to the throne on the right or the left, that's not for me to say. And when the other disciples that heard about it, they were furious, asking for permission to have privilege, these positions next to the throne. Come on. Why are you doing that before the rest of us get a chance to do it? We didn't even get a chance to ask. Come on, we need to bid for that contract. So Jesus hears about the fight among the disciples, and he calls them all together, and he did the kindest thing that he could do. He tried to reconstruct the framework in their minds. Loosen the bolts, take down the girders of the old lessons, put it back, open them up to what the kingdom of God is going to be like. He's been saying it throughout, but they've been ignoring it. You know, he says, among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as the rulers lord it over them, and the great ones are tyrants over them, but it's not going to be like that for you. But they nodded. Yes, that's exactly how it was. That's exactly how it was. And we nod our head because it's exactly how it is. Power is corruptible. And we Americans know that better than most. Yes, we say, go on, let's go, let's go. And Jesus says, no, The last will be first. It is not so among you, he says. And he takes down the scaffolding in their minds and clears it all out. And the first piece of the new framework is whoever wishes to be greatest among you must be your servant. And he wipes the sweat from his brow. The Son of Man came to serve, not to be served. Can you look at the disciples' faces after he says that and see how stunned they are? Jesus wants them to see the world in a new way. He wants a new understanding in their minds from that time on. And it just sounds crazy. How can you become great by being a servant? Why would you lower yourself like that? Why would the Messiah, the new king, give up his life? It makes no sense at all. And if they're honest with themselves, the disciples will never, ever make sense of the world again. But there's no madness in Jesus' eyes. There's no sadness in Jesus' eyes. There's determination and compassion. And if anything, the disciples just have to realize that this is their problem, not Jesus. Jesus asking them to tear down the old framework. Jesus asking us to see the world through God's eyes. Jesus inviting everyone to construct new meaning in new ways. To see the kingdom of God for what it can be. And I read this and I think to myself, I don't think I'm going to be able to do that. Because the old understandings and the old way of seeing the world is too entrenched in my mind, in my habits, in my thoughts, in my patterns. It's too embedded into my calendar, my actions. But here's the truth this morning. Unless we tear down the old frameworks, unless we put up some new ones, we will never make sense in our minds and our hearts and our spirits, never make sense of Jesus or God's kingdom or our world. We will never make sense of this story about Jesus, about God's kingdom, and our place in it. How do we believe Jesus when he talks about the lastness and the leastness? How do we serve our fellow humans without constructing obstacles and ways to separate us and let us off the hook? How do we love unconditionally our neighbor? Every neighbor. Jesus is asking us to do it. And he has to wonder if we have the will.